Widowed rancher buys bride for 2 chickens. What she did next shocked the whole West. The wind whispered low across the barren Montana plains, stirring loose snow in lazy spirals. Jacob Mackenzie sat on the edge of his porch, hands clasped between his knees, boots rooted in the frostbitten earth. The sun was barely a smudge behind the clouds, and the world felt still, too still for a man who used to have a house full of sound. 2 chickens scratched at the thinning patch of soil near his feet, oblivious to the gravity they now held. They weren't just livestock anymore, they were what remained. After the fever took his wife Mary and their young boy, after the debts swallowed the crops and winter silenced everything else, those chickens became the last markers of something alive. The envelope on the kitchen table stayed unopened. He didn't need to read the banker's words to know what they meant. Soon, this house wouldn't be his. The land would pass to someone who never walked its fields. His silence wasn't bitterness. It was a kind of knowing. Like the way old trees stop creaking when the cold gets deep enough. That afternoon, Cornelius Briggs arrived with boots too polished for this part of the world and a smirk that didn't quite match the season. He brought a strange proposition: trade the chickens for a bride. Jacob didn't laugh. He didn't scoff or slam the door. He just looked at the birds, then back at the man, and said nothing at all. Because sometimes silence is all that's left when your pride has been stretched too thin to speak. This wasn't about how much the woman was worth. It wasn't about bargains or shame. The real question, the one that clung to Jacob's ribs tighter than hunger, was this: after everything's been taken from me, who? The first letter from the bank came in October, tucked in an envelope that looked far too clean for Jacob's table. He didn't open it at first. Didn't need to. He'd seen enough of those letters in his time: white paper, black ink, and a polite promise that if he didn't pay by first snowfall, his home would no longer be his. He stared at it for 3 days, letting it gather dust and the occasional gust of wind from the cracked window. By the 4th day, he cracked the seal, just to make it real, just to let the weight of it settle. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He just folded it and slipped it under the wooden bread box where Mary used to keep her recipe cards, as if hiding it there might make it less true. That morning, he fed the chickens slower than usual, watched them peck the earth with a kind of desperate precision. 2 hens, both getting older. They weren't laying like they used to, but they were the last pieces of routine he had left. A few clucks, a scatter of seed, and something about it still resembled life. He found himself talking to them sometimes, not because he thought they understood, but because they didn't interrupt, didn't offer pity. Just feathers and small, unbothered eyes. When Cornelius Briggs had first made his offer, 2 chickens for a woman, Jacob had nearly slammed the door in his face. It sounded like something out of a cruel joke, but Cornelius didn't flinch. He just said, "You're not paying for love, Mackenzie. You're paying to not freeze to death alone." And that somehow hit deeper than it should have. Days passed. Nights stretched longer. Snow crept down from the mountains, a silent countdown no one could argue with. Jacob stared at the ceiling for hours at a time, lying on a bed too cold, too quiet, and far too large for one person. He remembered Mary's voice. Not the words, just the way it softened the room. The way it made dinner taste better and silence feel like peace, not punishment. When he finally decided, it wasn't with some grand declaration or dramatic sigh. It happened while boiling potatoes. He looked out the window, saw frost gathering at the corners, and said, "All right." He didn't tell anyone. There was no one left to tell. He found an old basket in the barn, lined it with frayed burlap, and gently placed the hens inside. One squawked in protest, but he hushed her like he would a child. "Easy now," he murmured. "It ain't your fault." He paused at the door, hand on the knob, heart thudding too loud for such a still house. For a moment he thought about backing out, about keeping the chickens and facing whatever came next. But then he imagined another winter in silence, another season of waiting for nothing. That thought chilled him more than any storm ever could. So he stepped outside. The wind didn't welcome him. It bit at his cheeks and hissed beneath his coat. He pulled his hat low, adjusted his grip on the basket, and started walking. Every step felt like surrender. Every crunch of snow beneath his boots sounded like goodbye. On the trail he thought about dignity, what it meant, where it went, and whether he'd already lost it. Was it in the chickens, in the act of trading them for a stranger he hadn't met? Or was it in the fact that he still cared enough to ask himself these questions? He didn't know, but he knew this. The house was too empty, his bones too tired, and the echo of Mary's laughter too faint. He wasn't looking for salvation. He wasn't even sure he was looking for companionship. Maybe he just wanted to matter to someone again, even if only for one more winter. "I'm not buying anyone," he said aloud. The wagon pulled up just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the frostbitten yard. Jacob stood on the porch, hands buried in his coat pockets, trying not to look like he was waiting. But he was. The horses huffed clouds into the air. The driver jumped down, stretched his legs, and motioned toward the back. A few seconds later she stepped out, Catherine Walsh. She wore a dark blue dress, simple but worn with a kind of quiet pride. Her boots were caked with dust from the journey, and she held a canvas bag that looked far too light for someone who had just left everything behind. Her hair was pinned, not neatly, but thoughtfully, like she had done it with care, even if her hands were tired. Jacob expected. He didn't know what he expected. Someone timid, maybe, grateful or meek. But she held herself with the stillness of someone who'd stood alone in rooms full of noise and come out quieter, not smaller. They didn't shake hands. "Jacob," he said, out of obligation more than instinct. She nodded. "Catherine." It was awkward, not because of tension but because of absence. No rules, no script. Just two people who had agreed, through silence and middlemen, to share a roof for reasons neither wanted to say aloud. He led her inside. The cabin was small but clean. A fire was already going, and he'd put a second chair by the hearth without really thinking about it. She noticed. The first thing she did wasn't sit. She walked to the window where the two chickens scratched in the dirt, heads bobbing with instinct. "Are those the ones?" she asked without turning. Jacob hesitated. "Yeah." She nodded again, slowly, then turned to face him. "I thought I was coming to be a housekeeper," she said. "Not something bought with feathers and feed." Her voice wasn't angry. It was factual, tired in a way that had nothing to do with travel. Like this kind of misunderstanding wasn't new to her. Jacob rubbed the back of his neck. Wasn't exactly my idea either. Silence sat between them, heavier than the fire's crackle could soften. They didn't speak much that night. He made soup, served 2 bowls. She ate slowly, as if testing each bite. When he offered her the bedroom, she declined. Said the cot near the stove would be fine, warmer probably. He nodded. Left her a blanket. Went to bed without saying good night. But as he lay there, eyes open to the beams above, he thought about the look she gave the chickens, not disgusted, not pitiful. Just knowing. Like she understood exactly what it meant to be exchanged without ever being asked. The next morning came with the pale light of winter and the kind of hush that made every movement feel louder than it was. Catherine rose early. Jacob heard her before he saw her, footsteps soft but purposeful, water splashing into the basin, the scrape of a chair being moved. He stepped into the main room and found her already sweeping, sleeves rolled, jaw set like someone who'd made a quiet decision to be useful, no matter the circumstances. They didn't talk. He made coffee, poured 2 mugs. She nodded in thanks and sipped carefully. It wasn't polite silence. It wasn't awkward either. It was the kind of silence that comes from 2 people figuring out how to occupy the same space without pressing too hard on each other's bruises. Breakfast was simple, eggs and toast. They ate without eye contact, forks clinking against mismatched plates, but something unspoken moved in the air between them. Not warmth, not yet, but an absence of cold. When the plates were empty, Catherine stood, gathered the dishes, and began to wash them without being asked. Jacob watched her for a second longer than he meant to, then turned away. Later that day, while sorting through a small stack of items Mary had once kept in the living room, Jacob found an old book of poems, leather-bound, edges frayed, but the pages still clean. Without much thought, he wiped off the dust and left it on the table where Catherine had been sitting by the fire. He didn't say it was for her, didn't even look her way when she noticed it. But she touched the cover gently, ran her finger along the spine, and offered a single word: "Thank you." That night, as the wind howled outside and darkness wrapped around the cabin, a sudden gust slipped through the chimney and blew out the lantern on the table. The room was swallowed in black for half a breath. Jacob moved to relight it, but Catherine was already there, calm, steady. She struck the match with a practiced flick and held it to the wick. The flame bloomed again, casting soft gold across her face. Her hand didn't shake. Jacob didn't say anything, but something shifted in his chest. Not love, that would be too quick, too cheap, but respect maybe, recognition. A silent acknowledgement that she wasn't just surviving here. She was choosing, in her own quiet way. The days grew shorter, and with each one, the silence between them softened, not from words, but from the things they began to do without asking. Catherine started chopping wood without instruction. Jacob set aside her favorite mug every morning. It wasn't connection in the grand sense. It was survival made gentler by presence. One evening, as the wind picked up and the cold pressed harder against the windows, they found themselves sitting near the fire, not by plan, but by pattern. The book Jacob had given her now lay open in her lap, and the flickering light danced across the pages. Outside, the wind howled like a memory trying to be heard. "She used to sing when it stormed," Jacob said suddenly, eyes fixed on the fire. "Mary, my wife. She'd hum hymns, soft at first, then louder, like she was trying to drown out the thunder for our son. It wasn't a story. It was more like a note slipped between sentences." Catherine didn't answer right away. She closed the book gently, set it on the armrest. "My father sold the shop to pay my debts," she said. "Didn't tell me until after. I left before I could watch what it cost him." Jacob looked at her then, not with pity but understanding. The kind that comes from seeing a wound you recognize, even if it's not in the same place. "I thought coming out here might mean starting over," she added. "But it's hard to tell if you're building something new or just sitting in a quieter ruin." He didn't reach for her, didn't try to offer some tidy reassurance. Instead, he tossed another log into the fire and said, "We buried them side by side. The fever took them fast." The wind groaned at the edges of the house, and for a while, that was all the sound there was. Two people sitting with their ghosts, not trying to silence them, just listening together. Later, as they both rose to head to sleep, Catherine paused by the window. Snow was starting to fall in slow, hesitant flakes. "It sounds like an old song," she said softly. "That wind." Jacob nodded. "One I've heard too many times alone." They didn't speak again that night, but something in the silence had changed. Not filled, just made less hollow. As if their separate griefs, when set beside each other, had finally begun to. It was late afternoon when it happened. The sun cast long gold fingers across the floorboards, and Catherine had just stepped into the pantry to fetch a jar of preserves. That's when she saw it, curled like a forgotten rope beneath the bottom shelf, scales dull but unmistakably alive. A rattlesnake. She froze, breath stuck in her throat. The jar slipped from her hand, shattered against the floor. Jacob, outside stacking wood, heard the crash and was through the door in seconds. "What is it?" he asked, stepping into the room, eyes scanning. She pointed, voice barely a whisper. "There." The snake flicked its tongue, unmoved, coiled in lazy menace. Jacob didn't think. He grabbed the old coal shovel leaning by the stove, stepped in front of her and swung once, hard, fast, final. The crack echoed through the house, and for a second neither of them moved. Then Catherine exhaled, slow and shaky. Jacob turned, face unreadable. "You all right?" She nodded but didn't speak. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm, not for balance, not from fear, but as if to anchor something. He didn't pull away. "I hate snakes," she said, voice thin. "Most folks do," he replied, setting the shovel aside. They stood there for a moment longer in the aftermath of fear, surrounded by broken glass and a dead thing that no longer had power. Jacob began cleaning up the shards while Catherine fetched the broom. They didn't talk, but something had shifted. Later that night, she placed a clean plate at the table for him. He filled her cup first before his own. Small gestures, wordless but layered with new meaning. They still didn't call each other anything. No husband, no wife, not even partner. But when Catherine turned off the lantern, she paused by his door. Not to say anything, just long enough to let the silence say, "Thank you." And for the first time since she'd arrived, the storm came fast. One minute the sky was pale blue behind brittle clouds, the next it was swallowed in gray. Jacob had gone out to check the fence, a foolish decision maybe, but habits die slow, even in winter. Catherine watched him from the window, a shadow growing smaller against the rising wind. Then she heard it, not the storm, but the silence. No crunching boots, no door creaking open. Just white swallowing white and time thickening like syrup. She waited longer than she should have. Then, instinct louder than reason, she pulled on her coat and stepped into the cold. The wind clawed at her sleeves. Snow bit her cheeks. She followed footprints half buried, the shape of them wobbling like a man limping. She found him just past the tree line, crumpled beside the fence, leg twisted beneath him. "Jacob!" she shouted, voice stolen by the wind. He didn't respond, but his eyes fluttered. She dropped to her knees, checked for breath. Still there, shallow but steady. He'd fallen hard, maybe broken something. The cold would finish what gravity started if she didn't act fast. She had no strength to lift him fully, but inch by inch she pulled. She dragged him through drifts, heels slipping, hands raw. He was heavier than he looked, grief and history tucked in every bone. The door slammed behind them like a final heartbeat, and she collapsed beside him, chest heaving. The fire was nearly dead. She piled wood with shaking fingers, struck the match with the same steady hand that had relit the lantern days ago. When she turned back, his lips were blue. "No," she whispered, pressing a warm cloth to his face. "Not like this." She sat beside him, wrapped them both in every blanket they had, and did the only thing left. She sang. Not loudly. Not perfectly. Just enough for the sound to fill the room where silence had always lived. Amazing Grace, slow and soft, the same song he had mentioned Mary used to sing when storms howled outside. Her voice cracked on the second verse. But she didn't stop, because it wasn't about melody. It was about memory, about calling someone home. And somewhere between the third verse and the quiet that followed, Jacob stirred. His eyes opened, faint, dazed. "You sang," he murmured, barely audible. "You came back," she said. He blinked, tears welling in a man who hadn't cried in years. "I didn't know anyone would pull me home." Catherine placed her hand over his. "You're not just alive. You've been chosen to live again." And in that flickering room, with snow pounding the windows and breath curling into the air like smoke from old regrets, something new was born, not just gratitude, not just survival, but the beginning of a life neither of them had dared to believe was still possible. The troop arrived like color splashed across a canvas of snow. Painted wagons, jingling bridles, voices that carried like laughter around a fire. They called themselves the Starbound Players, traveling musicians, dancers, storytellers who moved from one frozen town to the next, melting a little of the cold wherever they went. Jacob had seen them once, years ago, back when Mary was still alive. But this time, it was Catherine who stood by the window, eyes wide, mouth parted slightly as she watched the caravan wheel past the gate and into the clearing. That evening, the performers lit lanterns around the yard and invited everyone within a day's ride to come watch. Not many came. Winter held most folks hostage, but the show went on anyway, as it always did for those who lived by song. Catherine sat near the back, arms folded tight, as the fire cracked and the violinist sent music curling into the air. Jacob noticed the way her foot tapped under her skirt, just barely, as if her body remembered something her mind had buried. Then Magdalena Rossi stepped forward, an older woman with wild gray curls and eyes that saw too much. "We have room for one more voice tonight," she said, scanning the crowd. "Isn't that right, Catherine Walsh?" Catherine froze, heads turned. Her name hung in the air like steam. Jacob looked at her, surprised, but said nothing. She stood slowly, not because she wanted to, but because something in her wouldn't let her stay seated. The stage was just a crate and a stool, but when she stepped onto it, she stood like someone who had once belonged there. She didn't introduce herself, didn't explain. She just began to sing. It was a song from long ago, not one Mary had sung, not one you'd find in hymnals. Something old, maybe Irish, maybe just hers. And it poured from her like thawed water from a spring long frozen. Pure, true. The crowd went still. Even the wind seemed to listen. Jacob had never heard that sound from her before, not just the notes, but the ache inside them. It wasn't performance. It was memory, voice made from bone and fire. When she finished, no one clapped right away. There was only stillness, reverence, the kind that comes when something too honest has just been witnessed. Later, as the others packed up and laughter returned, Magdalena found her by the fence. "You remember now," the older woman said. Catherine looked at her. "I didn't think I had anything left." "You didn't forget your dream," Magdalena said gently. "You just got too quiet to hear it." Catherine turned toward the house, the chickens asleep in their coop, the firelight flickering through the window, Jacob's silhouette moving inside. "Don't live like you never dreamed," Magdalena whispered. "You're still here. So is the song." And as the stars blinked to life above the quiet yard, the morning after the performance, the house was too quiet again, but not in the same way. The air was filled with something unspoken, suspended like breath not yet released. Catherine moved with practiced stillness, folding her clothes, tucking them into the old canvas bag she'd arrived with. No noise, no farewell, just motion. Jacob noticed before she even touched the doorknob. He didn't stop her. Instead, he stepped out to the woodshed, came back 10 minutes later and left a note on the kitchen table beside her half-read book of poems. It read, "If you're leaving for you, go, but if you're leaving for me, don't." He didn't sign it, didn't wait around to watch her read it. Catherine stood at the threshold for a long while. Her bag was packed, her boots laced. The door creaked when she opened it and the cold met her like a question. She stepped outside, paused. The snow had softened the ground overnight, muffling her footsteps. Only a few yards from the house she stopped walking. She looked toward the road, the same road that had brought her here, full of fear and frost and unanswered letters. A road that for weeks she thought would be her escape, and now she wasn't so sure. The bag dropped to the ground with a muted thud. She turned around. Inside, Jacob was by the stove, fixing a broken latch on the cupboard. He didn't look up when she entered, just kept working the way people do when they're trying not to hope too much. Catherine placed the note gently back on the table. Then she filled the kettle. The fire crackled. The metal sang as it warmed. 2 cups were set out, steam rising like old promises. She didn't speak. Neither did he. She sat down across from him, poured the tea evenly into both cups and placed one near his hand. There was no confession, no grand decision made aloud. But as they sipped quietly in the warmth, the storm still whispering against the windows, the truth settled in the space between them. She hadn't come back because he needed her. She'd come back because she had chosen to stay. The snow had stopped. The days grew longer by minutes, and light began lingering just a little past supper. Jacob and Catherine moved around each other with the kind of rhythm born not of routine, but quiet recognition. They were no longer figuring out how to share a house. They were figuring out how to share a life. It was on one of those thawing afternoons, while mending a saddle strap and sipping tea, that Jacob looked across the table and said, without ceremony, "I want to sell the ranch." Catherine blinked, not in disbelief, but because she had not expected it to be said so plainly. He continued, voice steady, eyes on hers. "I've spent too long trying to fix things that died long before I admitted it. This land, it's full of ghosts, of Mary, of our son, of a man I used to be, and I've buried enough." She set her tea down. "And what would you do after?" "Go with you," he said simply, "wherever that song takes you next." Catherine looked away. Out the window, where the fence still stood, where chickens still scratched through melting snow. She thought about the nights she lay awake wondering if she'd ever belong to anything again, to anyone. And now, this man, who once offered her shelter like a desperate trade, was offering his entire life, not as a bargain, but as a choice. "You're not doing this for me," she said carefully. Jacob shook his head. "No, I'm doing this because I want to know who I am when I'm not holding onto what's already gone." She stood up, walked to the edge of the room as if putting distance between the weight of his words and the pull in her chest. "You don't regret any of it?" she asked softly. "This house, this land, everything it held?" He answered without pause. "I regret all the years I didn't know I could start again." That silence returned, but it was a different kind, not empty, but brimming. Like breath just before laughter, like the moment before a curtain rises. She turned back to him, eyes shining with something more than tears, something braver. "We'll need to pack light," she said. And just like that, a man who once gave away his last 2 chickens for the chance not to die alone, now gave away everything he had not to hold onto someone, but to walk beside her freely, toward something neither of them had words for yet. The wagon creaked beneath them as it rolled slowly over thawing ground, wheels cutting soft trails into the earth. Behind them, the ranch shrank into the horizon, a silhouette against the morning light, no longer a home, but a memory respectfully left behind. Jacob held the reins, though there wasn't much guiding to do. The horses knew their pace, their path. Beside him, Catherine sat with her hands folded in her lap, her bag nestled between her feet, her eyes taking in the long stretch of open sky ahead. They didn't speak for a while. Words felt too loud for the softness of this leaving. But eventually, Catherine turned to him, her voice quiet, touched with something playful but sincere. "If it had been 3 chickens," she said, "do you think any of this would have gone differently?" Jacob smiled without looking away from the road, the kind of smile that lived in the corners of his mouth, easy, weathered, sure. "If it had been nothing at all," he said, "I still would have chosen you." She didn't reply, just leaned her head gently against his shoulder. They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. The space between them no longer held transaction or debt or uncertainty. It held air and breath and something earned the long way around. Behind them, the barn would be bought by a neighbor. The chickens, the last two, the ones who began this story, had been given to a widow down the road with 3 children and a garden that needed guarding. Ahead of them, no destination waited, only possibilities. Jacob looked sideways, catching a glimpse of her closed eyes, the line of her mouth relaxed in a way he hadn't seen when she first arrived. Not guarded, not watching for exits. "Do you miss it?" she asked suddenly, eyes still closed. "The ranch?" he asked. "No," she said, "the man you were before all this." Jacob thought for a moment, then shook his head gently. "No, I think he did the best he could with what he knew. But this version, the one sitting beside you, he's finally figured out what matters." And so they rode on, past fences and fields, into a future that hadn't been promised, only chosen. Because the price of 2 chickens had opened a door. But it was everything after, the quiet moments, the hard truths, the steady steps, that made the life they now shared worth more than anything either of them had dared to dream. In a small western town where the wind still carried dust and stories, a woman stood at the edge of the market square. No stage beneath her feet, no spotlight above, just sunlight filtering through the awning and the soft rustle of fruit baskets and fabric stalls. She sang. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Her voice wove through the air like smoke from a morning fire, gentle, warm, unmistakably alive. Children paused mid-play. A shopkeeper stopped sweeping. Even the horses seemed to quiet. And among them stood an old man with eyes like cracked glass, who watched her not as a stranger, but like someone remembering. He turned to the boy beside him and said, almost to himself, "They say she was once traded for 2 chickens." The boy looked up, puzzled. "But what she gave in return," the man continued, "was a man who remembered how to love." And the song went on, not because it was planned or promised or paid for, but because sometimes love doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives with a voice that keeps singing, long after the silence has forgotten how to hold you.